Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. We need another $800 or we stop right here. The cemetery worker's words hung in the rain-soaked air as the boy clutched his mother's photograph tighter. The other grave diggers leaned on their shovels, cigarette smoke mixing with the morning mist, waiting for a response that wouldn't come. The municipal cemetery stretched out in gray waves of headstones and forgotten names. The boy stood alone beside the half-dug grave, his thin black jacket soaked through, raindrops indistinguishable from tears on his 15-year-old face. Nobody approached him, not the funeral home director who'd already gotten his minimum payment, not the cemetery workers demanding more money, not the few distant acquaintances who'd already begun drifting back to their cars. From the shadow of an ancient oak, a figure in a black coat watched silently. His face, partially hidden beneath the brim of a wet cap, registered something changing in his eyes. Recognition, then decision. Keanu Reeves had come to visit an old friend's grave that morning, but fate had placed him at a different kind of crossroads. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. The cemetery worker took another drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing brighter as rain intensified around them. Look, kid, I don't make the rules. There's additional costs for the concrete liner and the weekend service. He gestured toward the partially completed grave with calloused hands. We've already started, but without the rest of the payment, your mom stays above ground. The other workers shuffled uncomfortably but remained silent accomplices. Their faces showed the practiced indifference of men who had learned to separate themselves from the grief they encountered daily. The boy, Michael, remained motionless, one hand gripping the framed photograph, the other deep in his pocket, fingers wrapped around a wallet containing exactly $27 and a maxed-out prepaid credit card. His mother had been sick for so long, the medical bills consuming everything. There had been just enough saved for what the funeral home had called their economy service, but now these unexpected costs materialized like ghosts, insubstantial in their justification but impossible to walk through. The funeral director had already retreated to his black Lincoln, engine idling, heater blasting against the windshield's gathering condensation. He checked his watch. Another service across town in 90 minutes. The three distant relatives who'd attended huddled near their cars, performatively discussing whether something could be done while inching toward drivers' doors. No one approached Michael. No one offered solutions. The social worker who had helped arrange things had called in sick that morning. Another broken link in a system that had failed this boy repeatedly. So, what's it gonna be? The cemetery worker crushed his cigarette under a mud-caked boot. His colleagues began collecting tools, reading the situation's inevitable conclusion. An older worker with rheumy eyes briefly met Michael's gaze, then looked away, ashamed but unwilling to intervene. The rain drummed steadily on the temporary awning over the casket, creating a hollow, persistent rhythm that seemed to count down the moments before Michael's last connection to family would be wheeled away. Back to storage, burial incomplete, a final indignity after years of struggle. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he placed his mother's photograph atop the casket, the glass catching raindrops that distorted her smile. In the photo, she was still healthy, still vibrant, before cancer hollowed her cheeks and dimmed her eyes. He wanted to speak, to beg, to scream, but the words remained trapped behind the knot in his throat. He was just a kid who'd spent the last 3 years helping his mother navigate treatments, insurance denials, and mounting debt. Now, in his moment of most profound loss, the world continued its pattern of closed doors and turned backs. The lead cemetery worker sighed heavily, impatience edging into his voice. We've got other jobs today. We need a decision." His hand moved toward the casket, ready to signal its removal. The funeral director had finally emerged from his car, walking reluctantly toward the scene, practiced words of regret already forming on his lips. No one noticed the solitary figure moving quietly through the headstones, approaching from the eastern path. No one saw Keanu Reeves remove his cap, running a hand through damp hair as his purposeful strides carried him directly toward the unfinished ceremony. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. "Excuse me." The voice was quiet, but carried a solid weight that cut through the rain. Heads turned as Keanu Reeves stepped into the small gathering, water dripping from his coat. The cemetery workers straightened instinctively, recognition dawning on their faces. The lead worker dropped the second cigarette he'd been about to light. The funeral director froze mid-stride. Michael, however, remained focused on his mother's casket, barely registering the new presence. "What seems to be the problem here?" Keanu asked, standing now at the edge of the burial site, his eyes moving deliberately between the workers, the funeral director, and finally settling on Michael. The lead worker cleared his throat, suddenly conscious of how he'd been speaking moments before. "Just a financial matter, sir," he managed, his tone noticeably softer. "Nothing to concern yourself with." The funeral director moved forward quickly, recognition and opportunity colliding as he extended his hand. "Mr. Reeves, what an unexpected honor. Are you acquainted with the deceased?" His professional smile couldn't mask the nervous calculation happening behind his eyes. Keanu ignored the outstretched hand, instead moving closer to Michael, who had finally looked up, confusion momentarily displacing grief on his young face. "I heard what was said," Keanu spoke quietly, now standing beside Michael. "You're stopping this young man's mother's burial over $800? There was no accusation in his voice, just a straightforward question that somehow made the demand seem smaller, pettier when spoken aloud. The cemetery worker shuffled his feet, looking to his colleagues for support they wouldn't provide. "It's company policy," he muttered. "We need payment before completion." The words sounded hollow even to him. Keanu turned to Michael, his eyes gentle. "Is this your mom?" he asked, nodding toward the photograph on the casket. Michael nodded, struggling to reconcile this surreal moment with the crushing weight of the morning. "Sarah Wilson," he managed, his voice cracking slightly. "She was sick for a long time." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Keanu said, sincerity resonating in every word. He placed a respectful hand briefly on Michael's shoulder before turning back to the workers and funeral director. Something in his posture shifted subtly, not aggressive, but unmistakably resolute. "I'd like to cover any remaining costs," Keanu stated simply, reaching inside his coat. The funeral director stepped forward eagerly, professional composure momentarily slipping. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. That's very generous. We can process that right away." His tone had transformed entirely, obsequious and accommodating. The cemetery workers exchanged glances, their body language shifting from dismissal to attention. The distant relatives, who had been pretending not to watch from their car windows, emerged cautiously, drawn by the celebrity presence they now recognized. Michael stared in disbelief, emotions overwhelming his ability to speak. This wasn't how things worked in his experience. Problems didn't suddenly resolve. Kindness didn't materialize from nowhere. The world had taught him harsh lessons about institutions and systems that processed human suffering with bureaucratic indifference. Yet here was a moment defying everything he'd come to expect. "But it's more than just continuing the burial, isn't it?" Keanu said, looking around at the sparse gathering. "This should be a proper goodbye." He turned again to Michael, speaking directly to him rather than about him, a distinction not lost on the boy who had grown accustomed to being discussed as a case number. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below, and let's talk. The rain began to ease as Keanu quietly settled arrangements with the funeral director, who was now all smiles and accommodating nods. The cemetery workers returned to their task with newfound dedication, their earlier reluctance replaced by careful attention. The older worker with rheumy eyes approached Michael hesitantly, offering a folding chair produced from their truck. For during the service, he explained softly, guilt evident in his averted gaze. Word traveled quickly through the cemetery, staff and visitors alike sending surprised glances toward the small gathering that now centered around the famous actor standing quietly beside a teenage boy. 2 groundskeepers appeared with additional chairs. A caretaker brought over a proper awning to replace the minimal temporary covering. Each small kindness seemed to materialize once the first barrier of indifference had been breached. Keanu moved with purpose but without drawing attention to his actions. He spoke briefly to the funeral director, who nodded vigorously before hurrying to his car to retrieve items from the trunk. When he returned, he carried a guest book, memorial cards, and a proper stand for the mother's photograph, items that had apparently been available all along but deemed unnecessary for an economy service. "Did you want to say something about your mom?" Keanu asked Michael quietly as they stood together watching the preparations. "You don't have to, but this is your time with her." His voice carried no pressure, only gentle support. Michael swallowed hard, clutching the photograph he'd reclaimed from the casket. "I wouldn't know what to say," he admitted, the words barely audible. "It was just us for so long. Everything important was already said when she could still hear me." Keanu nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then maybe it's enough, just to stand with her a while longer." He remained beside Michael as the workers completed their tasks, his presence creating a buffer against the awkwardness that often surrounds profound grief. More people had gathered at a respectful distance, other cemetery visitors, staff, even the grounds maintenance crew. But unlike before, their presence didn't feel intrusive or judgmental. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The funeral director, now hyper-aware of appearances, performed his duties with deliberate ceremony, offering words about Sarah Wilson's life that he'd clearly just learned from the paperwork, but delivering them with appropriate gravity. When the time came for the casket to be lowered, Michael found his voice at last. "She loved sunrises," he said suddenly, the words emerging unbidden. "Even at the end, she'd make me help her to the window to see them. Said it was a promise that got her through the night." His voice trembled but held. "She was always stronger than anyone knew." Keanu stood silent beside him, a steady presence as Michael spoke about his mother, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Each memory shared seemed to lift a fraction of the immense weight he carried. The cemetery workers paused their mechanical processes, listening with unexpected attention. Even the distant relatives drew closer, perhaps recognizing dimensions of the woman they'd barely known. As the casket descended into the earth, Michael placed his hand on Keanu's arm for support. The actor didn't move away or flinch at the contact. He simply stood firm, offering the stability the boy needed in that moment. What had begun as an incomplete, hurried disposal had transformed into something dignified, something human, not because of celebrity or money, but because someone had chosen to see a grieving child as worthy of time and respect. It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. After the final handfuls of earth had been cast and the cemetery workers finished their task with newfound care, People began to disperse. The funeral director approached with papers requiring signatures, his manner now solicitous toward both Keanu and Michael. The actor handled the interaction smoothly, shielding the boy from unnecessary details while ensuring everything was properly completed. "Do you have someone taking you home?" Keanu asked Michael as they stood before the now completed grave. The distant relatives had already departed with awkward waves and mumbled condolences, their brief attention span exhausted. "The social worker usually would, but she couldn't come today," Michael replied, reality beginning to reassert itself in his consciousness. "I can take the bus. I know the route." He'd become accustomed to navigating adult systems alone during his mother's illness. Keanu nodded, considering this information without judgment. "I have my car here. I could give you a ride if you'd like." The offer was presented simply, without pressure. In the car, Michael sat quietly, his mother's photograph cradled in his lap. The cemetery had grown small in the rearview mirror, but its impact remained heavy in the silence between them. Finally, the boy spoke. "Why did you do that? You don't even know us." Keanu was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "I was visiting a friend's grave this morning," he said finally. "Someone I lost too early." His eyes remained on the road ahead. "When I saw what was happening, I guess I recognized something in how you stood there. Alone, but still standing." Traffic moved around them, the everyday world continuing its rhythm. Michael looked out at passing cars filled with people unaware that his entire world had shifted irrevocably. "What happens now?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than his immediate future. "Right now, we get you home," Keanu replied gently. "The social worker has my contact information. There are some programs and people I know who might be able to help with what comes next." His words offered no false promises, just practical possibility. As they pulled up to the modest apartment building, Michael hesitated before opening the car door. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate for what had transpired but all he could manage. Not just for the money, for making them see her, see us. Keanu nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable. The way you spoke about her, that's how she'll be remembered now." Later that evening, as news spread through social media about Keanu Reeves attending a stranger's funeral, the narratives varied widely. Some focused on celebrity kindness, others on the financial gesture. Few captured what had actually transpired, a moment where someone with influence had simply refused to let human dignity be determined by financial status. For Michael, the details of that day would eventually blur, but certain images would remain perfectly preserved. Rain on his mother's photograph, the sound of earth on casket, and most clearly, the simple act of someone standing beside him when it mattered most. Not as a famous actor, but as one human recognizing another's pain and refusing to look away. In his darkest moment, someone had chosen to see him, and in doing so, transformed an ending into something that contained the faintest beginning of what might come next. Wow, what a story! If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.